130 vies arrachées.
Good afternoon, you're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are the news trending today. World leaders begin addressing delegates at the UN climate conference in Paris. President Obama says the U.S. will take the lead in fighting against climate change. General Security Head Major General Abbas Brahim says he will not abandon his efforts to release 16 servicemen held by Nusra Front after last-minute demands by the militants delayed a swap deal to release the men. And MP Sleiman Frangieh criticizes the country's three main Christian parties for rejecting his presidential aspirations without posing a valid argument. World leaders have begun addressing delegates at the UN climate conference in Paris, known as COP21, aimed at forging a deal to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Both U.S. President Barack Obama and François Hollande issued rallying cries to officials, urging them to commit to reducing emissions. Obama said his country recognized its role in contributing to the climate change crisis and will take the lead in fighting against it.
Nearly 200 nations have assembled here this week. A declaration that for all the challenges we face, the growing threat of climate change could define the contours of this century more dramatically than any other. And what should give us hope that this is a turning point, that this is the moment we finally determined we would save our planet, is the fact that our nations share a sense of urgency about this challenge and a growing realization that it is within our power to do something about it. I've come here personally as the leader of the world's largest economy and the second largest emitter to say that the United States of America not only recognizes our role in creating this problem, we embrace our responsibility to do something about it. Here in Paris, let's secure an agreement that builds in ambition, where progress paves the way for regularly updated targets. Targets that are not set for each of us, but by each of us, taking into account the differences that each nation is facing. That's what we seek in these next 2 weeks. Not simply an agreement to roll back the pollution we put into our skies, but an agreement that helps us lift people from poverty without condemning the next generation to a planet that's beyond its capacity to repair. Here in Paris, we can show the world what is possible when we come together, united in common effort and by a common purpose. And let there be no doubt, the next generation is watching what we do.
For his part, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has urged world leaders to build a durable climate regime with clear rules, which all countries can follow, and said Paris must mark a turning point.
Paris must mark a decisive turning point. We need the world to know that we are headed to a low emissions, climate resilient future, and there is no going back. The national climate plans submitted by more than 180 countries as of today cover close to 100% of global emissions. This is a very good start, but we need to go much faster, much further, if we are to limit the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius.
Now for some news in Lebanon, General Security Head Major General Abbas Brahim says he will not abandon his efforts to release 16 servicemen held by the Syria-based Nusra Front, no matter what obstacles the extremist group throws his way. In remarks published in local daily Al Jumhuriyah, he said everything was finalized concerning the swap deal and was adamant not to give up even if the kidnappers continue employing their blackmail policy. Last-minute demands by the Nusra Front delayed a swap deal to release the men held by Nusra for over a year. Brahim, who was tasked by the government with hostage negotiations, says talks to win their freedom have not totally collapsed and negotiations were ongoing despite last-minute hitches. MP Sleiman Frangieh has criticized the country's three main Christian parties for rejecting his presidential aspirations without posing a valid argument. A statement issued by Frangieh's press office says the Free Patriotic Movement, Kataib, and the Lebanese forces' objections to his candidacy could be considered if they presented a plausible reason. Frangieh had met with FPM leader Gibran Bassil at the latter's residence in the North Lebanon district of Batroun. The statement comes in light of media reports that Bassil's meeting with Frangieh failed to thaw the tensions between the two leaders over the latter's presidential ambitions. Christian leaders have been testing their widespread differences as parties nominate candidates to fill Lebanon's presidency, which has been vacant since May of last year. Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu has dismissed any suggestion Ankara should apologize for downing a Russian warplane in its airspace last week after winning strong NATO support for the right to defend itself. 6 days after Turkey shot down the Russian fighter jet in the first known incident of its kind since the Cold War, calls for calm have gone largely unheeded as Ankara refuses to back down and Russia responds with sanctions. Russian President Vladimir Putin, however, says he was waiting for an apology from Turkey following the meeting with NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, in which he won the alliance's firm support for the right to self-defense. Davutoglu also warned that such incidents continue to be at risk as long as Russia and the US-led coalition bombing Islamic State in Syria worked separately. Turkey will help stem the flow of migrants to Europe in return for cash, visas and renewed talks on joining the EU, in a deal which the Turkish Prime Minister called a new beginning for the uneasy neighbors. Leaders of the 28 European Union states met with Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu in Brussels to give their collective political blessing to an agreement hammered out by diplomats over the past few weeks. A key element is 3 billion euros in EU aid for the 2.2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, intended to raise living standards and to persuade more to stay put rather than attempting to cross into the EU.
State clearly that we do not expect anyone to guard our borders for us. That can and should only be done by Europeans. But we expect a major step towards changing the rules of the game when it comes to stemming the migration flow that is coming to the EU via Turkey.
We have re-energized our accession process. We have agreed to have an integrated strategy against all instabilities in the neighborhood of Europe, and also to work together shoulder to shoulder regarding the refugee crisis. All my colleagues in Europe, they agree that Turkey and EU have the same destiny as the members of the family of our continent, and Turkish membership will be an asset, not only to EU, to Turkey, but also to the global peace.
As world leaders gather in Paris to address climate change, China issues its highest-level smog alert this year. That's coming up next. Welcome back. You're watching the news in English. An Israeli court has found 2 Israeli teenagers guilty in the murder case of a 16-year-old Palestinian who was abducted, beaten and burned alive last year. Hamad Abu Khdeir was abducted outside his home in Shuafat in East Jerusalem and driven to a forest where he was burned alive on July 2nd of last year. The third Israeli, considered the main suspect in the case, was found responsible by a Jerusalem district court, but his verdict was delayed after his lawyers submitted an insanity plea. The court is expected to consider the plea on December 20th, and sentences in the trial are expected on January the 13th. The 2 minors found guilty, they said they were involved only in the abduction of Abu Khdeir, but not his killing. EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini has met Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the EU says it will continue its role in Middle East peace diplomacy. Israel had decided to suspend contact with the EU over the bloc's reinforcement of labeling rules on imports from Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
Well, actually, what I can tell you is that High Representative Vice President Federica Mogherini this morning discussed this issue with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Paris on the margins of the COP21 summit. What I can also tell you is that the EU-Israel relations are good, broad and deep, and this will continue. And when it comes to the Middle East peace process, the EU continues and will continue to work on this in the Quartet with our Arab partners, with both parties, because of course the peace in the Middle East is of interest to the whole international community and of course to the Europeans themselves.
Pope Francis has made a visit to a communally sensitive neighborhood in the capital of the Central African Republic, urging the Muslim and Christian communities to set aside their differences and focus on rebuilding relations. Francis visited the central Kuduku Mosque in the besieged Bangui district of PK5, an area that has seen some of the most horrific Christian-Muslim violence since a coup of March of 2013. He described Christians and Muslims as brothers, urging them to reject hatred and move towards a path of reconciliation. China has issued its highest-level smog alert this year as world leaders gather in Paris to address climate change. Monitors reported levels of pollutants 22 times those recommended by the World Health Organization. To help reduce the smog, authorities issued orders to temporarily shut down or reduce production at factories in the country. Classes have also been suspended, while heavy lorries have been ordered off the roads. More details in this report.
People living in Beijing woke up to another day of hazy skies on Monday as thick smog continues to blanket the city on the same day world leaders meet to discuss the climate in Paris. The city's air quality index, which includes measurements of airborne pollutants like sulfur dioxide, stood over 500, the worst this year. The Chinese government says people should stay indoors when levels reach above 300. Residents who were outside said the smog was uncomfortable. For every breath, when you get up in the morning, your throat will feel somewhat prickly, this person said. Environmental experts say besides being a public health issue, China's pollution is damaging the country's economy.
The central government, they know that actually climate change is no longer, or air pollution is no longer just an environmental or public health issue. It's actually hurting the economy as well. So I think they really know that. So I do think they would like to do something for it, but that's still not enough. That's what I would say.
China's smog highlights the country's issues in battling pollution caused by the coal-burning power industry and will raise questions about its ability to clean up its economy at the United Nations Climate Summit in France. Despite promises to slash coal consumption, environmental officials admit China is unlikely to meet state air quality standards until at least 2030.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. World leaders begin addressing delegates at the UN climate conference in Paris. President Obama says the U.S. will take the lead in fighting against climate change. General Security Head Major General Abbas Brahim says he will not abandon his efforts to release 16 servicemen held captive by Nusra Front after last-minute demands by the militants delayed a swap deal to release the men. And MP Seyman Frangieh criticizes the country's three main Christian parties for rejecting his presidential aspirations without posing a valid argument. Those are your top stories for this Monday. I'm Linda Tamim, and I wish you all a very nice evening.
130 vies arrachées.